Okay, so I'll turn this over to Tracey Turner. The title of this session is Challenges and Opportunities for Heritage in Rural Manitoba. And I'll leave it to you, Tracey, to introduce the panelists and manage the process from here on.
Thank you, Sheldon. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So hello, everyone. I'm Tracey Turner. I'm the CEO of the Manitoba Historical Society, and I'm delighted to be here today. I am also collections manager for the St. Norbert Provincial Heritage Museum. As well, I work as a museum consultant, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Manitoba, currently in anthropology. So enough about me. Again, I'd just say I'm delighted to be here. I've been overwhelmed at the wisdom and knowledge that's been shared so far as part of this Heritage Summit, and it's been an exciting part to be part of the organizing of this inaugural event. I'd like to share that I recognize that I live and work on the homeland of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And would like to just say today our discussion is meant to generate a discourse on the challenges and opportunities for heritage in rural Manitoba. And this is a personal issue for me, as my previous tenure was as a rural museum director, and I was intimately connected with many of the critical issues and shortcomings that happen in running a rural heritage organization and a museum, and what we see happening in historic sites and heritage programs in rural settings. So I think we're going to have a great discussion here. So today we formulated the question, how do we address the unique challenges for heritage preservation commemoration in rural Manitoba? And to discuss this question, we're going to meet and hear from Monique Brandt. She is from the Association of Manitoba Museums. Hi, Monique.
Hi.
Ralph Groening, President of the Manitoba Association of Manitoba Municipalities.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, nice to meet you. And Christy Henry, University Archivist at the Brandon University. Hi, Christy, nice to have you here. And we'll also be hearing from James Kostuchuk, an instructional coach, educator, and chair of the Portage Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee. Hi, James. Nice to have you here too.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. So today we're going to hear first from Monique Brandt, Director of the Association for Manitoba Museums. I can share that I've known Monique for quite some time and met her serving as a Museums Committee member for the AMM a few years ago. So Monique, please introduce yourself briefly and feel free to share with us your thoughts on the challenges for heritage preservation and commemoration in rural Manitoba.
Oh, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Thanks so much, Tracey. Before I start, I want to give a big shout out to the previous panel. That was amazing. Very hard act to follow. All about, I hope that I can look in new ways and teach in new ways. So to go on, as I said, I'm Monique Brandt. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Manitoba Museums. And the AMM represents about 200 museums in the province, about 3/4 of which are in rural areas. Though I live in Winnipeg now, I was born and raised in rural Manitoba, and I'm still a frequent visitor to my home community. I'm going to talk in general about heritage, but more particularly about museums, because that's what I know best. The various reports I'm going to quote and take my facts and figures from are available online, and I'll make sure that the links are available after the summit. Excuse me. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but museums and heritage institutions play an important role in our society. They are the institutions that help us connect our past to our present, our natural heritage to our human experience, and one culture and community to other cultures and communities. They can provide a safe haven for open and honest discussion. They can teach us about others and about ourselves, and they contribute to the mental and physical health of society. They're centers for lifelong learning. They're important resources for our schools, key assets in our tourism industry, repositories of our cumulative knowledge, and resources for research and understanding, as Adele pointed out earlier. And we haven't talked much about this today, but museums are incredibly important economic drivers. In 2017, museums and art galleries in Manitoba generated over 70 million in direct spending. That's 70. Various studies, including ones that you've done earlier, put the economic return of museums at 4 to 1. So Manitobans in general actually do believe in and support heritage, believe it or not, as we're looking for people. Donations from individuals and corporations were 10.9 million in 2017. There is a museum or 2 or 10 or 13 in every rural riding in the province and in most of the urban ridings as well. Museums are well supported in their communities, not as well as we'd like perhaps, but there's over 7,000 volunteers who have donated hundreds of thousands of hours. And if we to put a dollar figure on those hours, it's over $7 million in labor, and that's in 2017 alone. In that same year, 45,000 people were members of a museum. And this one blew me away. 2.5 million people visit museums in Manitoba alone in 2017. Now I know because it was 2017, the numbers might be higher, but that's still amazing in a province with 1.3 million people. And with the importance of digital, as we're seeing now with COVID, 5.1 million people explored museums online. So museums are also, of course, an integral part of our education system, as we know. They were visited by over 300,000 kids in 2017 alone. So museums hold a vast and vital part of our heritage, about 6 million artifacts and specimens, and estimated over 200,000 linear meters of records, often housed in heritage buildings. So that's some of the good stuff. So some of the challenges, all museums, we've talked about this earlier today. Unstable funding, a lot of it's project-based, you don't know when it's coming, don't know if it's coming. Stagnant funding and shrinking. The community museums themselves, the small group, have in effect faced a drop of funding of over 58% in the last 35 years. They're seeing increased demands for services. They're seeing more visitors. These visitors are rightly expecting more polished, more sophisticated, and more nuanced offerings. Digital access is becoming increasingly important. I mentioned 5.1 million online visitors, so visits increased tenfold between 2013 and 2017. Museums have to learn how to be relevant and representative of all peoples. We need to learn how to engage youth, how to be green, how to be financially sustainable. We're very dependent on volunteers. The average volunteers outnumber paid staff about 8 to 1. And it can be hard to find qualified board members or any board members sometimes. So in addition to this, I find that rural museums, some have extra challenges. First one, they're very dependent on volunteers, a ratio of 20 to 1 for paid staff. In that study I've been quoting, 109 small museums had a total of 9 paid staff between them. So it's a wonder that people can function at all. So first off, your rural area, you probably have a smaller population. Some of the RMs in the province have fewer than 900 people. 2,000 to 3,000 seems to be about the average. Smaller population means smaller tax base. It means less money to help support the museum. It means less people to draw on. And also what we're finding is that a lot of the rural areas, the smaller areas are growing smaller. Over half of the RMs lost population between 2011 and 2016, as little as 1.3% and as much as 11.4%. What we're often seeing also in a lot of the rural areas is an aging population. For example, now this isn't by municipality, but the Prairie Mountain Health Region, the largest age group is 75 and plus in that region. So we have our population's getting smaller, it's getting older, you have less people to draw on. And that also means that the rural museum might have less expertise to draw on. And this one, I don't know, I've never thought of this one until earlier this fall. I'm going to say seasonal issues. The busiest time of year for a museum is spring, summer, early fall. May, June through September. What's the busiest time if it's in a rural farming area? Well, obviously it coincides. Remoteness could be an issue. The museum itself might be in a remote issue. The heritage institution itself might be only accessible by car. So who gets to work, who gets to volunteer, who gets to visit, you might be dependent on cars. And a big issue that has really come to light, I think, during COVID, we've been talking about it for a long time and various governments are working on it, but a lack of good, high-speed, reliable, and affordable internet service is really, really having an impact on, I think, our heritage in rural areas. And I would also put the lack of reliable and strong cell service. I'm sure any of us can tell stories about being, getting 5 miles out of where we might live and having no cell service. So lots of challenges. Sorry, it's not morning, but I still need my coffee. So lots of challenges. And I've got some suggestions. And I know the reality of working in a small rural museum. I know how tough it is. I know I'm not probably telling people anything they don't know, but here's some of my ideas. And I'm pretty sure can't do anything about people getting older. You might be able to work with your RM to maybe get more people in your area. You might be able to advocate for better broadband and self-service. But those are things that are all sort of out of our control, but maybe there are some things you can do. So if you're a heritage institution and you're struggling, this might sound really obvious, but have a plan. Know who you are, know what your purpose is. Why do you exist? Where do you want to go? What do you need to get there? How are you going to get there? And break it down into manageable chunks. Second part, get help. Don't try to do it by yourself. I would guess that every single one of the organizations, the provincial heritage organizations represented here today, can and do offer guidance and help for people. Talk to us, talk to them. Connect with your Municipal Heritage Advisory Council if you have one. If you don't, talk to your RM. They can possibly help you too. I'm not saying people can do things for you, but they might be able to guide you, help connect you, point you to resources. And I know it's overwhelming, but, reach out. Connect with your local community foundation. Rick Frost talked about the Winnipeg Foundation. There's 55 community foundations across Manitoba. Connect with them. They exist to serve their community, and that includes you. If you don't have a local community foundation, then call the Winnipeg Foundation. Connect with your local government, with your RM, because frankly, if you don't have the support of your local government, your town, your village, your RM, it's highly unlikely you'll survive. I'd also suggest connect with your provincial regional office. I think it's called the Community Development Branch now, but they can probably help too. Okay, so plan, get help. Third one, again, we know this. You grew up in a rural area, you know about working with people, and you know about helping others. So cooperate, cooperate, cooperate. You already work with your local schools, and if you don't, get started. Some schools give credit for volunteering. Maybe the schools can have research projects that use your institution for school credit. Field trips, they might come to you, or museum in a suitcase, go to them. If you want to hire summer students, make sure the job is interesting. Give them projects to do, give them something real to do, and let them take ownership of it. Nobody wants to just sit there and wait for not very many people to come in. Other groups, is there a local service club? Is there a Kiwanis or a Rotary Club or a Knights of Columbus? Work with them. You probably have very similar goals. And heck, you probably even share a whole bunch of the same volunteers, if my knowledge is correct. And the last one I'd say, and this actually relates directly to the previous panel I was talking to, and it's getting more people involved. And to do that, you need to know why people don't attend or support or visit or whatever, why they aren't engaged in your institution. And the two main reasons are, I don't see my own life experiences reflected. I feel like I don't fit in. So, and this was particularly important for three broad groups: youth, which I've talked about earlier, newcomer Canadians, and Indigenous Manitobans. So it doesn't just mean opening your door and saying, well, hey, you can come in if you want to. People have to see themselves reflected. They have to feel like they fit in. I've already talked about how some ways to get youth involved. And this has also come up earlier in these sessions. Young people are more likely to get involved if issues that interest them, such as environmental rights, human rights, are being addressed. Work with them. A number of rural areas have seen an influx of newcomers. Invite them. Sometimes the newcomers want to know more about the place that they've moved to, but give them the opportunity to tell their stories, to share their experiences. You'll probably find more commonality than you think. And the last is to address Indigenous people. Go to your local band counselor. Please talk to the elders. You don't know who to go to? Connect with the panel members we just had today. Work with them. And I think the first thing is let them tell the stories because they haven't been told. And these Indigenous stories are our stories too. How can you do that? Offer them an opportunity to have an exhibition or stage an event or use the facilities. Whatever you do though, get out of the way and let them do it. Help if want, but ask for it, but get out of the way and let them tell their stories. So I've talked about the challenges in heritage in rural areas and some suggestions to address these challenges. I want to conclude with two advantages I think that rural heritage institutions might actually have. And the first is people are actually interested in community heritage. One of the studies that was done, released this spring, people are as likely to have visited a local community museum in the last year as they were to have visited both the Manitoba Museum or the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. They're interested in local community stories. They're interested in that personal connection. So there is an interest there. But I think the biggest advantage that you might have in a rural area is that incredible sense of community. It's so beautifully illustrated. You know your community, they know you. They might know your mother and your nephew and your third cousin twice removed, but they know you, and people are more likely to support those that they know. So there's challenges, there's some advantages possibly. So again, meet those challenges, plan, ask for help, cooperate, invite, give up ownership. And lastly, be a friend. If you need others to support you, then you have to support them, even if they aren't your third cousin twice removed. Thanks.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you very much. Some great points made there. Really nice to hear some of the advantages cited there as well. Now I'd like to turn the floor or the screen over to Ralph Groening, who's the president of the Association for Manitoba Municipalities. So we'll pose the same question to you. Do you have anything to offer in terms of what you think we can do to address some of the unique challenges for heritage preservation and commemoration in rural Manitoba?
Well, thank you, Tracey, and Monique. I really appreciated the comments you made. I think you know, a lot of your comments align with the work that I do. You're talking about broadband. Of course, our organization has been working enthusiastically. As a matter of fact, the federal government announced today another huge pot of money that is in part going to be directed at broadband and connectivity. So. Yeah, it's a huge challenge, but we share some of the same challenges. And as a matter of fact, Monique, and you know this, that we are or you are the other AMM. So I guess we can fight over who is AMM, but we both are. And I had the real privilege a year ago to present greetings at your annual event, your annual general meeting, and I think the relationship, and I'll kind of roll into my comments. I think the relationship between our organization and the work that you do is very important, and my comments will reference some of the collaborative ventures that we should be supporting each other on. So, as I said, good afternoon. My name is Ralph Groening. I'm the president of the Association of Manitoba Municipalities, AMM. Our organization represents all 137 towns, cities, municipalities in Manitoba, all of them, including the city of Winnipeg. And it is my real pleasure to provide some comments here at hopefully what will be and continue to be an annual event, the Heritage Summit. I'm very passionate about history. It's a hobby of mine, and so this is a really good fit. And it was my pleasure to be able to accept the invitation to comment. Now, our organization, one of the responsibilities of the organization of AMM, our executive director, the four of us, we meet all municipal leaders in their own communities. We go to all communities. I've traveled all over Manitoba, and this has provided me with an excellent opportunity to travel, to experience all of rural Manitoba: Churchill, Wascata, Lac du Bonnet, Vita, Swan River, Victoria Beach. I've been to Garland. Who else has been to Garland? Who knows? Garland is the little secret. Have you been to Garland? The airplane? You know, it's kind of a rite of passage for me as an executive. You know, you go, okay, we'll stop at and take a look at the Air Canada Viscount that's sitting there. It was going to be a restaurant at one time. I don't know what happened, but it's a Manitoba curiosity. So anyhow, this knowledge of Manitoba rural, and I'll identify rural as all of Manitoba outside of Winnipeg, will help provide some context, and I'll provide a municipal context to my remarks. So, challenges, opportunities for heritage in rural Manitoba. Well, you know, it acknowledges the people that have built our communities, the institutions that are established, churches, schools, organizations, the events, and I'll reference floods later on, the events that define our communities. And then finally, and this is more typical, I think, of what we think of heritage is the collection of artifacts, maintaining artifacts, and having them available to kind of help us connect and remember our collective past. Challenges. I'll offer a few challenges. I won't belabor the first one, which is funding, and we understand, Monique, and I do appreciate, and we have met with the Minister of Culture, Tourism, and so often have made that very same argument. There is not enough funding. We get that, and we're certainly on board with that. Number two, lack of effective communication. And I'll define the problem the way that I see it. You know, we have heritage communities all over Manitoba. They do great work. Their volunteers are tireless. They're passionate about what they do, about their plans, their projects. But often, because of this focus, this is my opinion, because of this focus, they tend often to look inwards. They you know, museum committees often are a closed shop, and they struggle to reach outside. You offer some comments about needing to expand that volunteer base. It is important that communities not be protective of their responsibility to maintain and guard over the heritage that they're responsible for. You need to reach out and you need to open up and say, how can we all collectively, and I'll comment later on the need for collective action. Here's an interesting comment. I mention this because in our travels in Manitoba, so often municipal councillors that we meet with will say, well, you know, if only we were a star attraction. We need to be a star attraction there. And yes, you know, star attractions have a great benefit, but we should not lose sight of the fact that we have valuable heritage resources in our communities. Let's find a way to promote them. We need, you know, protecting heritage is not a competition. And so what I would suggest, and I think you referenced this, we need to have a regional approach. Let's not be parochial about what we have in our little community. It's not just ours. Let's expand. Let's develop collective strength to protect and promote our heritage resources. We need to have a return to the regional tourism organizations that we had a number of years ago. I think that was, and they were a real benefit for all of the small communities to identify ways in which they could work together and promote collectively their resources. Those are a few of the challenges that we have. There are many more. You've offered some. I am more excited about talking about the opportunities. And you mentioned digital, and I am certainly on board with that. Use social media. Exactly. And I, in preparing this, I went on Facebook. Everybody has a site. The Waller Museum in Nepal, great stuff. The Whitemouth Museum, Steinbeck Heritage, of course. Moore's Museum, my hometown, has wonderful, two little communities. I grew up in Kane, Manitoba. Who knows where Kane is? We have a Facebook site. People post pictures. They share memories. They ask questions. What happened to this? It's wonderful. Sperling and the Arm Morris also has. Everybody's got a Facebook site. They are a wonderful opportunity to share and expand the conversation. Okay, here, this is the heart of what I'm talking about. Connect with you, and you mentioned it. Connect with your local municipal councils. Use their resources. Absolutely, use your organization to facilitate and make the contact. Make it productive, offer to be collaborative. Hey, this happens to us all the time in the RM Wars and other municipalities. People come in, they're asking for money. No, my advice, don't start with that. Start with, hey, how can we work together? Can you post stuff on your Facebook, on your website? Can we work with you? Can we collaborate? I'll reference later some of the ways in which communities have done that. Through active transportation, walking trails, incorporating that. So, museum resources, and if you're talking to councils, they are about quality of life. And what we hear from community people as they begin to move into our communities, and we have some communities that are thriving in Southern Manitoba, they want the basics. What do they want? You want to have good schools, you got to have sports facilities, your parks, green space, walking paths, active transportation. Incorporate your heritage resources, your museums into a quality of life argument. Councils like to hear about quality of life because that's what can make your community different from other communities. And there are great opportunities to do that. I will give you an example. The community of Rosenor, it's part of my municipality, devastated by the 1950 flood, disaster, challenged by floods in the 1960s. We're in a floodplain, I'm sorry. But they're resistant, persistent people. They rebuilt their community. The entire community, about 700 people, evacuated in 1997. 40 homes were destroyed. What we did is that we designed an obelisk. Then we incorporated that into our walking trail system in the community of Rosenor. It shows the levels of all of the different floods starting in 1826. And it gives people that walk through this great little park and walking trail, gives them a visual of what levels of flood would have been without the protection that both the federal and provincial governments have provided to this community. It's a great way to show the strength of the community. It shows the way they've survived the disasters, and they have overcome those challenges. Other examples of collaborative work between community organizations and civic leaders. Bethel Park and Winkler, great job. They had one of the first hospitals in Southern Manitoba taking care of their sick and ailing. The Boundary Trails Hospital was built. What the city did together with local organizations is built this wonderful park acknowledging people. I think there's even a war memorial in a Mennonite community. Good stuff. Way to go, folks. It's a great example of how you can work collaboratively with local councils. The Marine Museum in Selkirk, I think, is a great example of how the community can show pride in their heritage. The Whitemouth Museum, and I mentioned it before, has incorporated what is, I think, a great museum. I've been there a number of times, but it's incorporated all of their structures and their artifacts into a walking trail system. Well done, way to go. The RM of Morris, I'm the reeve of the RM of Morris. What we did to acknowledge our educational heritage is that we encouraged, the council agreed, we put signage up in all 32 locations, original locations of the small schools that educated the children of the original settlers that moved into the RM of Morris. Great, it's a great acknowledgement of people that helped build our community. Another regional museum, good example of a regional museum is the Prairie Mountain Museum in Shoal Lake. Great stuff, great stuff. Okay, final comments. And I think if you haven't got the sense of it by now, I think look for leaders who have a passion for heritage and leadership skills, develop community collective strength to protect your heritage. Make it a quality of life argument. That is very, very important. It is important to remember and acknowledge the individuals, people who built, established your communities, do them the respect they deserve and they've earned, and incorporate that heritage with your councils, with your communities, into the spirit, the character of the community that you have today. So those are my quick comments. And as I said, pleasure to be here and provide some context from a municipal leader. Thank you very much. Tracey, back to you.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks very much. So I'm pleased to invite Christy Henry, Archivist from Brandon, here to provide some comments about our question now. Christy, could you please introduce yourself a bit and share your presentation with us?
Sure. I created a PowerPoint because I don't trust myself to just talk off the cuff. So I'm going to share my screen with you.
Perfect.
All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Christy Henry, the University Archivist here at Brandon University. I suppose I'd like to start my presentation with a few caveats. The first is that although the title of the panel today refers to heritage in a broad sense, I'm going to be speaking strictly about archives, as that's what I'm most familiar with. That being said, and based on the comments that Monique and Ralph have already mentioned, I think that heritage institutions in rural Manitoba in general have some common challenges. And second, by no means am I an expert on all rural archives and archivists in the province. I consider myself to be a rural archivist and that I work in a rural archives. I've also been part of the Association for Manitoba Archives Rural and Northern Archives Manitoba Special Interest Group for over a decade now. But my experience is still more urban and institutional than a lot of rural archives. Also, my experience is largely based in archival activities in the southern part of the province. So when I'm talking about rural, like Ralph, I'm looking at anything outside the perimeter of Winnipeg, because that's often how we define rural. And for fun, I just looked up the numbers, and essentially rural Manitoba then covers almost 650,000 square kilometers. That is a lot of heritage to cover. And from an archival perspective, at present, I don't think we know everyone who is doing archival work in the province. I also don't think we know what records are out there. And I think that the awareness and the anxiety around the idea that we've already lost certain memories and knowledge within our rural communities has been compounded by rural municipal amalgamation and rural depopulation. So challenges and opportunities. I think that technology represents both a challenge and an opportunity for rural archives. It does give us the opportunity to put our collections online, which gives us a global reach as opposed to just a more localized reach. And I think the demand for online access to archival collections has been amplified by things like Ancestry.com and genealogy-based TV programs. COVID has also shone a light on this, which is both a challenge and an opportunity, because it's forcing heritage organizations to change their priorities. So for archives, if we can't welcome visitors to our archives, how are we going to provide access to the collections that we're preserving? Social media is also a great way to expand an archive's reach. You can use crowdsourcing, social media platforms, the internet, to solicit help for photo identification, for transcription of documents, to advocate and promote your collections. However, archivists need to be aware that the fine print of user agreements in a lot of social media platforms actually grants the platform rights to the images you post. And archivists have to be very up to date with copyright and privacy laws, as well as data management principles. Then as a challenge is the technological capacity in rural communities, which has already been mentioned on this panel. Rural communities simply don't have access to the broadband, the equipment, the storage systems, and all of those are expensive. They're also short-lived, so the obsolescence means there's constant upgrading and costs involved. I know certain rural archives who are operating on less than $1,000 a year. So even though digital costs are going down, when you only have a couple of $100s a year to start with, technology can still be extremely cost prohibitive. Next, digital records or digitization requires long-term preservation in the same way that paper records do. And for archives, long-term implies forever. Which means if you're going to digitize things and store them digitally, you can't ever delete them, which means your storage costs are only ever going to grow. You also have the issues of maintaining file formats and having to migrate them over the years. So providing long-term access to records and ensuring their authenticity it's a serious challenge, I think, for archives in general, but for rural archives too. And then a general comment about technology. I think most of us are so used to the cool things we can do on our phones, like geotagging and facial recognition and scanning documents to PDFs, that we fail to appreciate that the same technology isn't always available at an institutional level. And I think this is especially true in small, underfunded, volunteer-based organizations such as rural archives. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that personal technology capabilities aren't always transferring to the archives. So with rural archives, archival work is very labor intensive and it requires a certain specialized skill set. I think a lot of people are probably, in the general public, are more aware of what libraries do and what museums do. I think archives are maybe a little less well understood. So it means that people who work in archives, especially like from a volunteer perspective, it can be a steep learning curve because it's not familiar work. Next, rural archives, like museums, are largely volunteer run and can be dependent on the passion of one or a few people. Volunteers are great in the sense that they are often very passionate, but they're also often older, which again is good because they may bring different skill sets to the table because they've come from such varied backgrounds as opposed to, say, professionally trained archivists. And anyone can learn if they have an interest in archives. I think the key is you need to marry the right people and their skill set or interest to the job that needs doing. I didn't put this on the slide because it only occurred to me today, but I think another issue for rural archives and rural archivists is a sense of isolation. There's even fewer of us than there are museums. And like I'm the only person who's an archivist by title in the entire city of Brandon, which means if I want to talk to other archivists, I'm having to travel basically, or reach out to people in other centers. I don't ever really just get to meet up with somebody and talk shop kind of thing. And it can be a challenge feeling that you're alone in the work you do. Finally, educational opportunities for people working in archives in rural Manitoba has often been challenging. People have had to travel very long distances, often at their own cost. Rural educational needs can be different than those of archivists who work in urban institutions. The cost of bringing speakers to rural communities can also be expensive. Rural communities, of course, don't have the capacity for virtual training necessarily. And finally, rural archivists don't necessarily have the technological skills or the interest in learning those skills. To a rural archivist earlier this week, and I mentioned the idea of maybe having a rural archives meeting over Zoom. And she and the people on her board, they weren't interested. They don't want to have to learn that skill. They have enough work they're doing and they just don't want to do it, which, okay, but it's definitely a challenge. Next, funding, which everybody else has already mentioned, because it's not specific to rural archives, but it does influence everything else. The Association for Manitoba Archives has not had a coordinator since the National Archival Development Program was cut by the federal government in 2012. This means that other than a very part-time office person, the AMA is completely volunteer run. What this means for rural archives is that we lost the liaison who could visit rural communities, who could assist them with establishing archives, deliver training that is needed. It's really left a hole in our community, the person who sort of tied us all together. And I think for a lot of rural archivists, Diane Hagland, who was the last coordinator, Diane was the AMA for them. They feel very disconnected from the provincial association since that position left. And then grants, there simply just aren't a lot of grants for archives in general. Most of them require matching funds, which rural archives often don't have. And it's also difficult in rural communities to find people who have the skill sets required for such short contracts at lower wages. Next, Indigenous communities. There's clearly a high interest right now in Indigenous histories and Indigenous heritage. And the archival community has committed to truth and reconciliation. And there's a recognition that Western record-keeping practices and archival methods are not 100% compatible with Indigenous culture and knowledge-keeping. And I think that's all really positive. So there's certainly opportunity for collaboration and partnerships to build capacity for Indigenous archives, whether that's facilities, whether that's collections, whether that's projects. However, the collaboration and the partnership, it needs to be done sensitively through engagement and consultation, and an understanding that archives and archiving need to fit the community and represent their needs, beliefs, and culture. So solutions, which is maybe optimistic. The first is collaboration. I think most of the challenges facing rural archives are too big for them to solve on their own. So collaborating with each other, with and through the AMA, collaboration with our respective communities, whether that's your local community or local Indigenous communities, as well as collaboration with other heritage agencies is really important. Next is flexibility. So if we're flexible in our methods, it would allow us to engage the maximum number of people and to further the preservation interests of heritage in our areas. We also need to understand that archives don't mean the same thing for every community, nor do they need to. The archives needs to fit the community, and we need to be flexible on that. What's important is preservation, not the stringent definition of what archives are or how archivists do their job. Next is advocacy, which is tied in with collaboration. I think there needs to be more advocacy, just making the public aware of what archives do and why they're important. I think because they can tie into things that rural municipalities, that governments, that businesses care about, right? You just have to figure out a way to educate them. The public also needs to be made aware that history is actually happening right now, especially in a digital age. If digital records are not basically captured almost the moment they're created, they're not going to be around to archive in the future. Lobbying for increased digital infrastructure for rural communities, whether that's broadband, whether it's digital storage, anything like that. Then we need to maximize digital technology, whether that's through crowdsourcing, through social media, through oral history projects to capture vital community memories, and the digitization of high-value rural archival records. Next, education, things archivists need to be up to date on. Project management skills. I think it was Monique mentioned, breaking your projects down into discrete units to encourage volunteer buy-in so they actually see the progress and feel like they're contributing. Rights management, oral history, digital technologies. And finally, and I don't think this is a very popular opinion, but accepting the idea of progress over perfection in the sense that we can't save everything. It's not going to happen. So all we can do is our best as defined by our communities. And also that ultimately people have the right to choose to be forgotten, right? Like you can't save every memory of every person. And finally, just as a project idea, in 1986, 3 faculty members at Groening University undertook a project to identify and describe the archival records that existed in public and private collections throughout southern Manitoba. It was funded by the Manitoba Heritage Federation, and the project was so successful that they ended up printing 4 volumes, totaling almost 700 pages of archival collections in the province. So on the screen, you can see the first of the 2 maps. So volume 1 and volume 2, then volume 3 and volume 4. Or alternatively, this is a list of all of the rural communities that they engaged with. And within each volume, they broke the records down by various categories, such as agricultural organizations, municipal and local governments, archives, museums and libraries, newspapers, schools, community organizations. And then each record in each volume gives a location, a contact person, conditions of access, and a brief description of the records. So what I would propose is doing a updated and expanded inventory of this material. And I think it would be a really great collaborative project. And it could be an open living document that people could make suggestions and additions to. So by doing this project, we could include Indigenous, Central and Northern communities for a more holistic picture of archival heritage within the province. We could determine who is doing heritage work and where it's happening, because I don't think we really know that. We could determine what records are in our rural communities. We could identify and prioritize what records need to be saved. It would allow us to direct effort and resources to those collections that are at risk. And it would also allow us to promote the rich heritage of rural Manitoba.
Thank you, Christy. Well, that was wonderful. Really appreciate you showing us that presentation. Now I'd like to finally invite James Kostuchuk to lend us experience about heritage preservation and commemoration in a rural setting. I was fortunate enough to serve with James on the Portage Heritage Advisory Committee for several years. And James, it's great to have you here. I'll let the floor over to you.
Thanks, Tracy. Really nice to see you again. This isn't part of my presentation, but I wanted to just comment on something that Christy mentioned. And that's that I'm sitting in the high school where I work, and next door to me is our school archive. And we have somewhere north of 50,000 images and artifacts in that room. And as we speak, I have 2 students who we received a donation of about 100 negatives from a family of a man who worked as a repo man during the Great Depression. And his job was to go around and repossess farm equipment. And I guess he took photos of all his repossessions as a record that he was doing his work. But many of you may not be aware that we have this huge archive holding. We probably have the largest collection of mid-20th century Manitoba photographs in Canada, right here in the school. And I think it's really important that we know what's out there. Not part of my presentation, but I just wanted to comment on that. My name is James Kostuchuk. I've been on the Heritage Advisory Committee. I think my 2-year term has been extended 12 times. They refuse to accept any resignations from me any longer. I've been doing this off of my side of my desk. I'm just going to tell you a snapshot of where my thinking is at today. And I look forward to any questions you might have. So I'm going to share my screen here. And can everyone see okay? Yes? Yeah, okay. So, I'm going to just start with a quick overview of what I'm going to say, in case some of you want to go get a coffee or need a break. And municipal heritage would be resistance to innovation. In my particular role, it's a public misunderstanding of the role of MHACs, and then a public misunderstanding of heritage issues in general. And for opportunities that I'll be talking about, I see a lot of hope with community foundations, partnerships with business, and new ways to communicate, all things that have already been mentioned. A little bit of background to the Portage Prairie Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee. We are funded by the City of Portage Prairie. We get $1,000 a year to engage in the projects that we do. And I thought I would just give you a brief backgrounder to what some of the things we've done recently. We have done projects related to publications, signage, heritage inventories, preservation, and of course, advising City Council. We recently, as an example, published a book of historic photographs of Portage la Prairie from 1870 to 1939. That was a committee project. We also recently engaged in a project where we've expanded the heritage signs that we have in the community. This is a sign that will be going on a mausoleum that we're restoring. But we have about 24 heritage signs across the city marking spaces that are important, both to settlers and newcomers, but also to our Indigenous community members. Another project that we have had a lot of impact on is creating inventories. For those of you that go to the MHS Pewego site, the high school has scanned and uploaded, I think we're approaching 10,000 images. We have thousands of images that need to be done, but we're slowly getting them online. We've also hired consultants over the years. We've done comprehensive inventories of heritage homes, heritage businesses. We also did one of rural municipality significant historic sites. And we also did one recently where we looked at natural heritage to have a look at, some of the, historic trees or historic green spaces. This is a project that we're working on presently. There's one mausoleum in Hillside Cemetery. If you go to YouTube, you can Google a short video we did with the Manitoba Historical Society called The Crystal Coffin. But this mausoleum has fallen into great disrepair because there was no funding to preserve it. So this year, we started work on, like all rural, councils that deal with heritage issues, money's always an issue. So we came up with a plan to reface the front of the mausoleum with concrete, and then the side we've built trellis, and we're going to cover the back of the mausoleum with greenery, and the front will be restored to how it looked when it was built in 1919. Other preservation things we do, of course, I'd mentioned photographs are one of our main community resources. We have a lot of them. So we spend a lot of time with scanning photographs and digitizing them. We also provide guidance. And this is something, I'll talk about this in a little bit. This is the Island Park Bridge in Portage la Prairie. And prior to its removal, the Heritage Advisory Committee was asked to determine whether we felt it was a heritage bridge and worth preserving. And I think we had a lot of octogenarians angry at us when we came to the conclusion that it was not indeed a heritage bridge. But we'll talk maybe a bit more about that in a bit. So the first challenge I wanted to just get into detail about is resistance to innovation. And this is the Portage la Prairie railway station. It's phenomenal. A small group of volunteers has brought this building, completely rejuvenated it. They've restored the whole front room, and I went there last year for a grand opening, and I had an amazing night. They had a bar set up and live music. It was phenomenal. And then several months later, I was invited to a community meeting to talk about their lack of success in getting funding. And it's a little bit frustrating for me, and I'll be honest with you, and it's that they've done remarkable work, but they want to have a railway museum. And, there's I looked this up, and there's 238 railway museums in Canada. And I just can't see personally that a railway museum would ever be a draw. So they have a huge building, and my suggestion was that half of the building that's been restored be used for some other purpose that would generate revenue, whether it is that you establish a bar or a restaurant or whatever it might be, and that the other half of the building then be used for your museum. And they also have a model railway club, but that was a very unpopular suggestion. And I think that sometimes we get stuck in our ways. I just can't see a railway museum being a huge draw to bring people to Portage Prairie, even though it's a beautiful space and they've done remarkable work. So I think we sometimes have to be willing to look outside the box. What people forget is that our job, generally speaking, is to advise councils. They often think we're the Save Every Building Committee, and that's not up to us to do. We can help organize that if someone wants to do it, but what we want to see is more of this. This is a house that became a bit of a issue in town. It's the oldest home in Portage la Prairie. It was built by Bishop Garrick in the 1850s. But the person who owned it, there was a suggestion that they might tear it down. And so we were asked to weigh in on it. And it's a weird thing, but this home was originally located to the south of Portage la Prairie, and it was a cabin and then a church, and it was completely disassembled. All the wood was removed from the site and recut, and they took the wood and then reassembled it into the house that you see, and then covered it with stucco and electrified it. And as a result, we really couldn't make a strong case for preserving it. Now, fortunately, because it did become a public issue, the people that own it have decided to keep it as a home, and they're fixing it up. And the last one is a misunderstanding of heritage issues. And I think that a lot of people, when it comes to heritage, they think that when you get a heritage designation, or that when you're on a heritage committee, that we have some access to a huge pot of money. And, you know, every time an old home or an old building is threatened in our city, they're like, you know, we need to put a heritage designation on it. But I think what they don't understand is that there is no huge pot of money to do this. If people want to save a building, really the best way to do it is to convince someone, a business or a homeowner, to move into it. So that's where we get into the opportunities. So my first opportunity I think is really terrific is community foundations. Our local MHAC is looking at taking the money we get from our book sales, which should be about $10,000, and putting it into the community foundation. And then that will be a bit of a nest egg that we can draw funds from over the coming years. Another one is that private partnerships can be really helpful for preservation. So the photo you see, this is an excellent example. This is Arthur Meehan's house. In the 1990s, it came up for sale, and a local group of people wanted to buy it and turn it into a Meehan museum and a coffee house. And as I told you, I have the liberty of being blunt. Had that happened, it would have been probably a bad decision. It would be the kind of building that would be on the municipal, you know, it would have cost a lot of money to operate. It probably wouldn't have a lot of visitors. They had talked about doing a partnership with the Conservative Party of Canada because it's the only prime minister from Manitoba and things like that. But it's been my experience that that just wouldn't come true. What did happen is a man who loved the home bought it, and he has meticulously restored it over the years. And we've seen this with other heritage buildings in Portage la Prairie, like the Land Titles building. It was purchased by a businessman who restored it, and he broke it up into individual offices, and he's renting it out. So it's not costing the city any money, and it's preserving the building. So when this sort of thing happens, if we can encourage private partnerships, especially with saving buildings, it's a great thing. And the last one I wanted to talk about for opportunities or new ways to communicate. I think it was just last month, the Portage la Prairie Memories Group was created. And I think in a month, they have over 4,000 members. The appetite for heritage is huge. So that kind of information, getting out into the public and sharing ideas and conversing with people has been really amazing. People are interested in heritage, we just have to figure out how to connect with them. So as my summary of what I had to talk about here is that I really see a need perhaps of having something like a Manitoba Heritage Coalition, I was really fortunate when I was, because as I mentioned to you, I do heritage off the side of my desk. It's a hobby. So I don't have any formal training or knowledge. And so it was handy for me to have someone like Tracey that I could call when I needed help. Because, and I'll tell you why it's important with the next slide, actually. The benefits of having a coalition would be that it's efficient. I often found even in Portage la Prairie, we're sometimes competing for the same grants, and that just doesn't make sense. If we sit down at a table, we can probably sort out what are the biggest issues facing our community and what do we want to fund. And there have been all sorts of crazy things that have happened in the past that then you wind up being saddled with. I mean, one of them is like, you know, there was a period where people were donating homes to museums, but they didn't donate any money to keep the house up. And I was out at our Fort Lorraine and I heard someone complaining that, you know, there were weeds around one of the homes, painted the home. The other thing is that it's nimble. When I'm doing something, I need advice quickly. So I want to have somebody that I can call, like Tracey, and get an answer. And the last one is I really like the fact that as a group, we're informed. I've really enjoyed listening to what you had to say today, and I feel better informed now. I suddenly started thinking about the Manitoba flag in a different way, and I'm going to leave today with some ideas that I'll take back with me. But I think those are the benefits of having a provincial coalition.
Thanks, James.
That is the end.
Thank you, James.
Okay.
So that was a wonderful presentation. Wanted to just quickly draw a question from one of the chat discussions that was going on before we wrap up. And one of the things that I'd like to maybe suggest is that RMs are often deficient when it comes to investment in operating funds for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, as we know. And this leads to deterioration, a lack of best practices in care. And the fact is, the CMA, the Canadian Museum Association in 2016, said that for every dollar invested in GLAM institutions, so galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, there was a return of $4 back to the economy and the public. And that's something to really consider. So in the chat, the discussion was, we really need to see a base funding model for rural galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, so that there can be a better distribution of resources. I wonder, Ralph, if you could speak to that really quickly in a couple minutes, because we have to wrap up.
My very quick question, and it's a great challenge, but the willingness to contribute to resources, historical heritage resources, even libraries, the appetite to do that is not large. So I think it's a great idea. I think to James's comment about putting a coalition together, I think working together collectively, you can build a better case for instance, a base funding model that would begin to provide the level of support that I think is the intent of the question. But I think you need to come together, first of all, with a group to have an organized strategy in order to make the case. Otherwise, you're just going to be one-off and you'll just be flicked aside. That's my experience, and I think that's accurate. We need to argue effectively and collectively.
Well, thank you for the concise answer. I'm sorry I didn't give you more time. So I'd just like to really thank all my panelists for this session. Wonderful comments and resources were shared, and I'm very grateful to have been here for this. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tracey. We are going to go into a break